Mercedes is under pressure like never before because the FIA has just uncovered how a hidden engine trick was giving them a crucial advantage. Kimi Antonelli is right at the center of the investigation, and what looked like dominance is now being questioned across the entire paddock. For 3 races, this system delivered extra power exactly where it mattered most, right at the end of qualifying laps, creating gaps of several tenths in a sport where thousands decide everything. But here is what makes this explosive. It was completely legal until it became a safety risk, a loophole inside the rules, a perfectly timed activation, and a rival team that chose to expose it instead of copying it. Now the FIA has stepped in. The advantage is gone, and the gap that once looked untouchable is already shrinking. And the real tension is not just about what Mercedes did. It is about how much performance they lose now that they cannot do it anymore. It all started in a place no one was really watching, the final meters of a qualifying lap. Because at first, nothing looked suspicious. Mercedes was fast. Yes, Antonelli was delivering clean laps, consistent performance, everything you would expect from a top team operating at its peak. But then, something strange began to appear. The advantage was always showing up in the same place, not in the corners, not in the braking zones, on the straight, right before the finish line. And in Formula One, when time is gained in the exact same part of the track, lap after lap, it is never random. It is designed. Now imagine this like a sprinter. Everyone else starts losing speed just before the finish. Energy fading, momentum dropping, but one runner somehow keeps full speed just a little longer. That tiny difference is enough to win. That is exactly what was happening. Because while other cars were starting to lose electric power at the end of the lap, Mercedes was still pushing at maximum output. And that raised questions. Not immediately, but slowly, quietly. Because at this level, teams notice everything, and what they noticed was this. The MGUK, the electric system that provides a huge portion of the car's power, is designed to reduce output gradually when energy runs out. It is a safety rule, a predictable drop, something every team has to deal with. But Mercedes found a way to delay that drop, not by breaking the rule, by going around it. They used an emergency shutdown system, something designed to protect the engine in case of failure, and turned it into a performance tool. At the perfect moment, just before crossing the line, they activated it. That allowed the car to keep full power for a few extra seconds instead of reducing it step by step. And those few seconds were everything. More speed on the straight, more time gain, better qualifying positions. And here's the key detail. There was no real penalty in qualifying. Yes, the system shuts down for about a minute after activation, but that minute happens during the slow lap back to the pits, so the loss did not matter. Only the gain did, and that is why it worked so well. That is why it went unnoticed at first, and that is why across 3 races it created a gap that looked completely natural but was anything but. Australia, China, Japan, the same pattern repeating itself, but here's where everything started to change. Because what looks perfect in data does not always behave the same way on track. And when it did not, that is when the real problem began. And this is where everything stopped looking clever and started looking dangerous. Because during Japan, something happened that no team could ignore. Kimi Antonelli was in one of the fastest sections of the track, fully committed, high speed, no margin for error. And suddenly, the power disappeared, not gradually, instantly. At almost the same time, another car came to a complete stop on track. And that is when the entire paddock started connecting the dots. Because this was not a coincidence. This was the downside of the same system that was creating the advantage. The MGUK had been switched off exactly as designed, exactly as planned. But now, it was happening in a situation where losing power was not just inconvenient, it was risky. Now, imagine being in that moment. You are entering a high-speed sequence, expecting full power, full stability, and suddenly the car behaves differently. Less acceleration, less response, less control. That is not just a technical detail. That is a safety issue. And in Formula One, safety changes everything. Because up until that moment, this was seen as brilliant engineering, a smart interpretation of the rules. But now it crossed a line, not a legal line, a safety line. And that is when other teams stopped watching quietly and started reacting. As temperatures increased, the internal components expanded, and that expansion slightly increased the compression beyond what was measured during the official checks. So, in simple terms, the engine was legal when tested, but more powerful when it actually mattered. And that is the key difference, because unlike the MGUK trick, which gave a short burst of advantage at the end of a lap, this was constant. Lap after lap, straight after straight, a hidden layer of performance that never disappeared. Now imagine two cars that look identical on paper. Same limits, same numbers, but once the race starts, one of them quietly becomes stronger. That is what Mercedes had. And for a while, no one could prove it because technically it was passing every regulation until the FIA looked deeper. They realized the problem was not the engine itself, it was how it was being measured. Cold versus hot, static versus real conditions. And that realization changed everything, because once you understand that, the solution becomes clear. You change the way the engine is tested. You remove the gap between what is legal in the garage and what happens on track. And that is exactly what the FIA is now doing. They are moving toward measuring engines under real operating conditions, eliminating that hidden advantage completely. So now both layers are gone. The short burst of power from the MGUK trick and the constant gain from the compression loophole. And this is where the real impact begins. Because when you remove two advantages at the same time, you do not just slow a team down, you expose their true performance. And this is where the numbers start telling the real story. Because once those advantages disappeared, the gap did not just shrink, it collapsed. At the beginning of the season, Mercedes looked untouchable. In qualifying, the difference was massive, around 0.7 of a second in some cases. In Formula One, that is not just an advantage, that is control. Control of pole position, control of race pace, control of the entire weekend. But after the FIA stepped in, everything changed. The moment the MGUK trick was removed, that gap dropped immediately from dominance to just over 0.3. And that was only the first hit, because the second change, the compression adjustment, is expected to reduce it even further, down to a margin so small that it almost disappears. Now think about that shift, 0.7 to barely 2 or 3. That is the difference between leading comfortably and fighting for every position. And you can already see the effect. Rivals are closer, qualifying is tighter. The sense of control is gone. Mercedes is no longer operating in a safe zone. But here's the detail that makes this even more intense. Even after losing both advantages, they are still ahead. They are still winning, which reveals something crucial. The car itself is genuinely strong. The engineering is real. Those tricks were never the foundation. They were amplifiers. They made a fast car look unbeatable. Now, without them, we are finally seeing the real level. And that changes the pressure completely, because now the gap is small enough for others to attack. Red Bull, Ferrari, McLaren, they are no longer chasing something unreachable. They are within striking distance. And when teams feel that, everything changes. Strategies become more aggressive. Risks increase. Drivers push harder. And that is when mistakes start to matter, because now every lap counts. Every corner matters. Every small error becomes visible. And that is where the real tension inside Mercedes begins, because for the first time this season, they are exposed. No hidden advantages, no extra layers, just pure competition. And in pure competition, there is nowhere to hide. So now the real question is no longer what Mercedes had, it is what they have left. And more importantly, is it enough to stay ahead now that the entire grid is closing in?